Welcome to the Deb Calvert channel on Bright Talk. Today we'll be talking about 10 surprising signs of a communications breakdown and how you can get back on track. Now let me just forewarn you, these are not the usual symptoms that you'd expect to see resulting from communications. You might not associate these signs with a communications breakdown. Nonetheless, these 10 signs do indeed indicate that communication skills need some attention inside your organization. So what I'll do is I'll describe each of the 10, and I'll offer you some tactical fixes, and we'll talk also throughout the presentation, we'll talk very strategically about making broader improvements that will keep you on track. But before we get started, let me take a moment to introduce Bright Talk and myself. For those who are new to Bright Talk, you should know that there are some really cool features here for you to take advantage of. First and foremost, let me point out that you have something called attachments. It says attachments and links, and I strongly encourage you to take a look at every one of those, download those, connect to those web pages. I will reference most, if not all of those, as we go through the presentation, and I can tell you what's relevant at a given time. But before you leave, just be sure that you take full advantage of those. Additionally, throughout the presentation, I'll be monitoring the questions that you post. I'll try to answer those naturally throughout the presentation where they make the most sense, but I will also come back to them at the end of the presentation, and if we run out of time, I will email you a direct response. So all questions will get answered in one way or another. And then finally, I'd like to ask your help. There's a place here where you can give me some feedback from audience. That's your opportunity just to rate the presentation and to give me any suggestions you might have for making future presentations stronger. Or if you have topics that you'd like to see presented on this channel, things you'd like to hear a people first perspective about, by all means, please be in communication with me. Now, if you are someone who's listening on demand instead of listening live, please know that all of those features I just mentioned, they all still work. You'll probably get some delays, though, on questions being answered because I only come back and check this periodically. So you should also feel welcome to email your more immediate questions. My email will be on screen for you all throughout the presentation, and I'd love to interact with you in that way. Now, just a little bit about me, the presenter and owner of this channel. I'm Deb Calvert, and I am the author of the award-winning blogs Connect to Lead, Connect to Win, and Connect to Sell. And it's true, connections are very, very important to me. I'd be honored if you'd connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter or Google+, wherever you might be on social media. My handle is on screen, along with my email address, and I'd love to hear your questions and your thoughts. My company is People First Productivity Solutions. We build organizational strength by putting people first. And I work as an executive coach, a meeting facilitator, trainer, and consultant to help people improve their workplace connections and to help organizations improve their people practices. Leadership development, supervisory skills, these are important components of a people-first environment, as is communication, the master skill that makes everything else easier. I've been a corporate HR director. I've worked with many HR, L&D, and OD professionals since opening my company in 2006. My talk today is based on hundreds of conversations with senior HR executives, with frontline contributors, and with people across the organization about the importance of communications. You can, by the way, you can subscribe to this channel and get more content each month from me if you'd like to. Bright Talk makes it really easy to stay on top of what's new and what's relevant, and I post new content every month for HR and for managers in all functions about how to be more effective in leading people. Okay, consider yourself all caught up on the commercial stuff. Let's get back to the business at hand. You came to hear about communications breakdowns, and I would like to start by talking about this. This is going to seem a little odd at first. Let me explain. See, when any of us, being human, when any of us observe and evaluate others, we may not even realize that we are being negatively biased in our assessments. This comes naturally. And likewise, when you consider your own actions and outcomes, you may not realize that you are positively biased. In other words, you're kinder in your self-assessment than you are in your assessment of others. This is a tendency known as the fundamental attribution error, and it causes us to praise ourselves and blame others in unequal measures. We externalize blame rather than accepting it, and we depersonalize praise rather than attributing it to those who have truly excelled. And by the way, this is particularly true in Western cultures. It gets in the way of our ability to be objective and fair-minded even as we're managing others. Stick with me here. I'll tie this back to communication in just a moment, but here's how the fundamental attribution error works. In any event, there are two factors that we could evaluate. We could evaluate the personal abilities, personality, the characteristics of the individual involved. And secondly, we could be evaluating the situation itself. And what we evaluate depends on whether the outcome was positive or negative. So that's what you see in the box model diagram there. When you put those things together, you come up with really four tendencies. The first one, when it's a positive outcomes are in the left column. And we personally are responsible. So now I'm in the upper left box. Self is responsible. The outcome is positive. When it's a positive outcome and we are responsible, we tend to attribute the success to our own innate qualities. We believe it was something about ourself that led to the success. You hear in your own mind, you hear things like, I worked really hard to make that happen. It was my intelligence, my experience. That's what we do when it's positive and it's about ourselves. Now, when it's a positive outcome and others are responsible by contrast, we tend to attribute the success to the situation itself instead of to the innate qualities of that other person. We say things like, yeah, that was really good timing, or she's just lucky, or the stars were all aligned. Now let's look at the other column, the negative outcomes. We do just the opposite. When it's ourself who was involved, up in the upper right-hand corner, it's a negative outcome and we are responsible. We attribute that failure then to the situation instead of to our own innate qualities. We say things like the deadline was unrealistic, the goals weren't clear, it was really bad timing. But when it's a negative outcome and it's somebody else who was responsible, we attribute the failure to the innate qualities of the person. In this case, we say things like, he's not a people person, she couldn't handle the pressure, she's too stubborn. So we're doing just the opposite. If it's negative, we blame the individual. If it's positive, we attribute that to ourselves. Situationally, we look at negatives and externalize them. And if it's the other person, then we put it onto them as their own qualities. And this happens in the workplace, but it also happens everywhere. It happens in our day-to-day interactions with others, social settings, close relationships. Fundamental attribution errors damage workplace relationships, and they impair your own credibility. This is a really dangerous thing not to be aware of, and if you have this habit, it's a tough one to break. So before we launch into communications and situations in the workplace that are causing communications breakdowns, I want you to be very aware of this because it's often the root, at the very heart of communications breakdowns where you work. So as we take a look at 10 situations that grow out of communications breakdowns, please keep this in mind. So the first communications breakdown, the first sign that you might be seeing, maybe you've seen something just like this with individuals in your organization, and that's negativity. At the surface, we see negativity, we see the impact on the environment. Every eye roll, every sigh, every sarcastic comment, and every complaint takes a toll on the team. Our first reaction when that's going on is to respond to the person or the persons who are exhibiting those negative behaviors. We ask them to stop, or we isolate them, or we begin to ignore them and hope that everybody else will too. Those responses, by the way, only exacerbate the problem because they're signaling that you're out of touch with the real problem. Now, of course, with everything I talk about here, there are exceptions. Sometimes certain people will just find anything to complain about, and they're choosing negativity and destructive behaviors in every environment. But please don't be too quick to assume that's the case, especially if you've seen positive and productive behaviors from that individual in the past. Far more often, this negativity is a sign that there's a communications breakdown. The breakdown in this case is that the focus has been lost. The manager or team leader isn't adequately conveying the big picture and keeping everyone's eyes on the prize. When you do communicate the big picture, people get inspired and they remain focused. Their energy gets channeled to what's positive and productive. Now, the second thing to think about here as you're trying to solve for this, as you're trying to get people focused where they need to focus, that's around the big picture, because the big picture is what gives people context. The big picture is what infuses their work with meaning. And there are 5 aspects to communicating about the big picture. Those are what I put for you on screen. To give people context, to keep them from getting into a negative slump, to focus them on what matters most, you want to be sure that every single individual knows why we on this team, why we do what we do. And beyond our team, those other people that we interact with or hand off our work to, we need to understand why they do what they do and how it all fits together. We need to understand the impact that interdependent departments and team members have on each other. And above all of that sits these common goals, the big picture. So how is it that we should be interacting for mutually beneficial outcomes? And when we aren't able to resolve our differences, when we don't see things the same way, what are the expectations? What is it that we should be doing for handling our differences and resolving conflicts so that the work that matters so much can get done? Now, speaking of conflict, sometimes you will see a communications breakdown that's evidenced by limited cooperation and excessive conflict in a team. I'm not talking in this case about healthy conflict, the kind that stimulates innovation and commitment. This is the other kind, the unhealthy conflict that drains people and goes nowhere. Typically, when people become contrary and unable to compromise or collaborate, typically that's because they don't feel heard or because they have a sense of powerlessness in their work. This is a communications breakdown between team members, and that could happen up, down, or across the organization. It sometimes happens in factions with different work groups, pitting themselves against each other, or with people taking sides, and over time barely remembering why the interactions are so adversarial in the first place. To address these kinds of communications issues, even the long-standing ones, you'll need to put some real effort into building team effectiveness. And there are many tools that can help with this. Maybe you've heard of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, that's MBTI. It's a fantastic tool for bridging communication gaps and for helping team members to come together. Maybe you know about the Thomas Kilmann conflict instrument. That's TKI, and it's a really good instrument if you have significant conflict and people can't seem to find their way through the conflict. With any of these kinds of tools, if you're looking to build team effectiveness and there's some history of adversarial relationships, you're going to want an outside facilitator who is well-versed in team effectiveness and able to really draw teams together. Now, when I'm talking about team effectiveness, it helps to clarify what that is. So let me just give you a definition to work with. Team effectiveness is the capacity that a group of interdependent individuals has to do 2 things: to accomplish their own individual goals and to accomplish their shared goals and objectives. And those two pieces are really important. In fact, this definition alone can be a breakthrough for helping people to see that they don't have to give anything up individually. In fact, they shouldn't give up what their individual goals are. They should work very hard to meet their individual goals at the very same time that they're working to meet team goals and supporting each other in their individual and team goals. Now, if you want to know more about team effectiveness, I encourage you to come over to the blog on our website that's called Connect to Win. The Connect to Win blog is the one that's all about team effectiveness, and every week we write there about ways that you can continue to work on this. Let's keep going with our communications breakdowns. Number 3, the third sign you might see is avoidance. This is another example of something you might be seeing when people don't feel valued or supported. And this is usually a gap in communication from management. It often stems from micromanaging or authoritarian styles of management. It can also happen when people are remotely managed and they just don't have a strong connection with their manager. To correct this particular breakdown in communication, managers must choose their own style and choose to use heart and soul versus a command and control approach to leadership more often. Let me explain why this one matters so much. This matters a lot because what I'm putting for you on screen now, these are the top 4 reasons that people leave an organization, according to Gallup. You'll notice, as you scan through these, that all 4 of these top 4 reasons, they're driven by the behavior of a manager, by what a manager does or does not provide to an employee. These are all about the connection to the work and the future with the employer. And you'll notice, too, that all 4 of these can only be corrected through communication. As we park on this slide just a little bit longer, let me explain it in greater detail. People leave organizations, and they often say they're leaving because they found a better opportunity or they found a position with better pay. That's what they tell us in their exit interviews. What Gallup did was they went and they interviewed people who had recently left a position, and they asked some probing questions. They asked things like, well, what caused you to go looking for that better opportunity or that better pay? They peeled back the onion. And these are the kinds of things that prompted people to go looking for a new job in the first place. Let me remind you here about that fundamental attribution error that we reviewed at the beginning. As a coach and consultant working with a wide variety of organizations, something I frequently see is a frustrated employee who isn't getting feedback, who feels disenchanted with their job and their manager. They've been trying to please their boss, and somewhere along the way, they just kind of gave up. So now they're doing the bare minimum. They avoid new challenges. They dodge tough assignments. One person put it to me this way recently. She said that she lost all passion for her job because she never got any praise and seldom got any feedback at all. The way she phrased it, she said that from now on she was just going to stay in her lane and keep her head down. Her manager, and others like him, other managers in this very same situation, her manager saw things very differently. He had noticed that she wasn't contributing as many ideas as she used to during meetings, and he was surprised because she didn't volunteer recently for a committee that he thought would appeal to her. But he had no idea that she was so disgruntled and that she'd started actively looking for a new job. The missing ingredient here was communication related to what mattered to that employee, just true connection between the employee and the manager, circling around the employee's performance. Positive or negative, this feedback matters greatly. The fourth sign that you might see of a communications breakdown is when people are not showing much initiative. When you see people talking about the same problems over and over again but taking no action to fix them, or when you see the status quo getting more respect than it's due, when you have people who just don't seem interested in making change, not even positive change, you're probably experiencing a communications breakdown. In this case, the breakdown isn't the lack of vision for that big picture. It's a lack of involving others in that big picture vision. See, people can't commit if they don't see themselves in the vision. They need to be shown and reminded of the benefits that they will realize if and when that vision is reached. To enlist other people in the vision, there are some things that you have to constantly communicate about. You have to convey expectations that are the things that are linked to the vision. This is what we need to do. This is what I need from you so that we can reach our top priority. It's so important that I'm asking you to do these things. And then making sure that everybody knows that's the priority and that they know why it's the priority. And they need to know how to support each other so that they're all on the same page and working together continuously toward that priority. And the example also needs to be there. So managers have to put themselves into that priority, show a commitment, continually not only talk about, but work toward the priority as well. That's where people see clarity. It's where they see conviction being communicated about that common purpose. And when that's happening, with that comes a better chance of correcting this communications breakdown too. If you're observing people who are defensive and deflect blame, or people who make excuses and blame others, people who are refusing to take responsibility for their own work and outcomes, you might be feeling like you've got the wrong people on the team. But before you leap to that conclusion, you may wish to pause and consider that people are acting this way because perhaps there's too much at stake. If there's a severe penalty for taking risks, experimenting, failing forward, innovating, or sticking their neck out, then people will naturally be afraid. And naturally, they're going to withdraw from taking responsibility. In your organization, on your team, if results and performance alone are recognized and rewarded, then it becomes increasingly difficult for people to make real effort, and it becomes practically impossible for them to try new things. What you need to communicate and cultivate, if it's at all possible in your team, is a spirit of entrepreneurship. Every individual is the CEO of the work they're asked to do. They're enabled and ennobled to innovate and to improvise as long as they get the job done well and on time. If you can encourage that innovation, that experimentation, and that ownership, if you can allow people to fail so long as they also take responsibility for the learning that must accompany failing forward, then this kind of communication around those expectations will be liberating. People will be re-engaged. They'll feel excited about their work if they're trusted to make it their own. Here's a little tool you can use. When you create a culture of ownership, you're not abdicating your own responsibilities. As the manager who's responsible for getting the work done through others, your job in a culture of ownership is to provide feedback and guidance. So let me describe for you this very simple model for giving feedback that will help you to do this more effectively. 3 parts to the 3W feedback model. The first is to talk about a very specific situation. Instead of generalizing, in the moment, as close to the situation as possible, you'll give this feedback and you'll start by neutrally, objectively describing what you observed, the situation. You might say something like, I want to point out that you were late to the meeting, about 10 minutes late this morning, and that's the 3rd morning in a row when you've been late. So it's just a neutral statement of the facts, the observations you've made. And right behind that, you're going to explain why it matters. If it doesn't matter, if there's no impact, this isn't feedback that's worth giving. But if there is an impact on the work, on the team, on the individuals standing in the company, that's the impact that you ought to talk about. So if I put these first two pieces together, it might sound like this. First, the what. Hey, I noticed that today you were 10 minutes late to the meeting, and it's the third day in a row that you've been late. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it matters. You see, that the team can't really begin the meeting or the daily work until we hear your report and have your updates. That means that all 15 members of this team are losing time. And although it may just be 10 minutes in the morning, when I multiply that out by the 15 people, 10 minutes each, that's a lot of work that we're losing. So you fully described the impact, and right behind that is the third W, the alternate way you'd like to see this happening in the future. In this case, it might just be, hey, we need to make sure that you're here on time. I need to know if you're not going to be on time. Let's talk about what's preventing you from being on time and see if we can't resolve that so that you can be here on time each and every day. When you keep it neutral and you explain the impact and you describe very plainly what you're looking for, it's easier for people to respond without becoming defensive and without being confused about what you want from them. Now, so long as we're talking about feedback, let's look at the other side of the coin. See, giving feedback, that improves communication, and it also boosts retention. Equally important is seeking feedback and input, giving people a voice in how the work gets done and a forum where they can be heard. You'll know this is an area where you're experiencing a communications breakdown if you see people shutting down or robotically doing what they're told without seeming interested in offering their own opinions or even in asking questions. One of the earliest signs of this communications breakdown is that people begin seeking a manager's input on the smallest of decisions, and they won't make moves unless those moves have been pre-approved. If this is happening in your team, make a deliberate effort to ask often for a variety of ideas and to seek out diverse thoughts about how to solve problems. Be sure to show gratitude for input and then make it very clear that you are going to be genuinely seeking to understand others' perspectives. Remember, you don't have to use every idea you hear, but it's a smart practice to truly listen and consider others' viewpoints. If you have team members who don't seem able to find and use their own voices, I've given you a tool that you can pass along to those folks on your team. It's a tool for team members who need extra support finding and using their voices. That's one of the attachments that I've given you. That one is a webinar right here on the same channel that's available on demand for people who might find value. Now, that active listening, as you're gathering diverse points of view, let me give you another model. We have the 3W feedback model. Here's a 3-part active listening model to remind yourself to listen in order. See, that hearing, that circle is meant to represent your ear. Hearing is passive. When we're hearing something, the sound is just falling on our ears. That's not the same as listening. Listening requires the brain. Active listening is an engaged, focused part of your brain. Your highest level thinking is where you are at the top of your brain. You're paying attention, real attention, not half attention, not distracted attention, not racing ahead to think about what you will say in response, but true, dedicated, focused attention. And when you do that, a little deeper into your neocortex, you'll be able to comprehend. You will perhaps ask questions for clarification. You will make sure that you are listening for both context and observing for feeling as well, so that you have a broader comprehension. And only then will you move to the T in this ACT model. That's when you'll do the talking, the responding to what you have fully heard and understood. There is more here, an attachment about the do's and don'ts for active listening in an infographic over there in the attachments. So feedback and active listening will really help to improve communications. for these two breakdowns and in many other ways. Let's keep going here, because when people are checking out all the way, checking out even more than what we've described so far, beyond not taking responsibility and not participating in meetings, at the next level of disengagement, you'll begin to see more absenteeism and tardiness. People are coming in late, they're leaving early, they're taking longer lunches and more breaks, and even when they're at their workstation, they're not fully present. This, too, can be a sign of a communications breakdown. See, people seldom adopt those negative work habits when they have a sense of belonging on the team. When people feel needed and valued, they're much more likely to take pride in their work and to desire being an integral part of the day-to-day duties. But communication is essential if people are going to see themselves as belonging and important. When's the last time you told someone just how important their work is and why? When's the last time you described how each individual contributed to a positive outcome for the team? This kind of encouraging and affirming communication relies on connecting the dots between what an individual does and why it matters to the team, why it matters to other people, and why it matters to the outcomes. Remember our definition of team effectiveness? It included that getting the team's collective goals met at the same time each individual's goals are met is the true measure of an effective team. When we overlay that with the big picture and the shared vision for the team, it becomes a lot easier for people to feel needed and to experience a sense of belonging. All the dots have to be connected, and that can only be done through both formal and informal communication. Unfortunately, a lot of managers have never been trained to do this and may never even have seen an example of it. Because this includes a vision, some would say this work is reserved for senior leaders. But let me tell you, unless you want to remain stuck in an environment where communications breakdowns are causing you to lose good people to bad practices, this must become the norm for every manager and supervisor in your organization. We have just 3 communications breakdowns left to talk about. These 3 are also tied to employee engagement. So let me take a bit of a tangent here. Employee engagement is defined as the emotional connection a person feels to the work that causes them then to apply additional discretionary effort to their work. The first 7 signs of a communication breakdown that we've talked about, all of those could be linked to an employee's emotional connection to the work. These next 3 are about the additional discretionary effort that you hope to see. And if you're not seeing additional discretionary effort, you're seeing declines in productivity instead. You're seeing people who no longer feel emotionally connected and have lost their desire to give their best or to give their all to the job. And you could, certainly you could choose to separate those underperformers from the company. Or you could first choose to view this as a communications breakdown that requires a manager to communicate differently and to consider how people are motivated. See, external motivators like the fear of losing my job, those aren't nearly as effective as intrinsic or internal motivation like emotional commitment. Let's just take a closer look at intrinsic motivation so we understand that concept. I like box models, so here you have another one. We've got 2 things. We've got, as we've described, intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic is anything that comes from inside the individual. Extrinsic is the good old-fashioned carrot and stick, the external kinds of things that we use to motivate people. And then we have positive, things that are viewed favorably, and negative, the kinds of things that we fear or wish to avoid. And we can put these four together. The most powerful of all, the most sustained type of motivation, the one that will do the best job of getting people to perform, is the upper right-hand corner. That's positive motivation that comes from inside the individual. Nothing else will ever be as effective as positive intrinsic motivation. Positive intrinsic motivation comes from employee engagement. Because of the intrinsic motivation that comes with an emotional commitment, that's what's proven to drive higher levels of productivity, and research also shows that that higher engagement yields higher levels of customer satisfaction too. So if your communications breakdown has gotten to the point where employees aren't representing your organization well, you're probably experiencing reduced customer loyalty, higher levels of customer attrition, more complaints from your customers. To improve their satisfaction, you need to work on intrinsic motivation and also on communicating in ways that help employees. See, people, they need to know what it takes to be successful. Employees invest themselves in the companies that invest in them. When it's clear that you are interested in seeing people succeed, they will develop more emotional commitment. With that emotional commitment, you get intrinsic motivation, and that leads to higher levels of productivity and customer satisfaction. Employee engagement matters a great deal. I've included a couple of attachments about this very important concept that every single manager should understand. There's a tool you can use individually. It's a checklist, just little simple daily things you can do that will have an impact on employee engagement. And then a whole webinar. So if you want to understand more about this research that I'm referencing or how employee engagement unlocks productivity and customer satisfaction and so much more, then check out that webinar. Now, one of the very, very best ways to demonstrate that you want people to succeed is to provide them with coaching for development. This is different. It's not the same as managing for performance. Managers, in fact, must wear both hats, the hat of a manager who manages for today's performance and the hat of a coach who develops people for ongoing success. Coaches use different sorts of tools and, in fact, must develop different types of skills to be effective in facilitating self-discovery and to get people working with self-direction confidently and autonomously. When people are coached, they begin to create their own pathways to success, and they will be intrinsically motivated and take charge of their own careers and the work that they're being asked to do. Employees who receive coaching do report higher levels of engagement, and we already know that engagement leads to productivity and improved customer satisfaction, but no surprise, it also leads to higher rates of retention inside your organization, and that emotional commitment and that additional discretionary effort, ultimately, the outcome is both top-line and bottom-line growth. Let me just point you back toward the webinar that I mentioned about engagement. All of this research is right there. Elsewhere on this channel, you'll find some great information about how to be effective as a coach. And if you are interested in retaining an external coach who can also help you derive all these same benefits, then please know that we have a team here at People First Productivity Solutions of certified coaches who can help you to create this kind of an environment. Now finally, there's one more sign of a communications breakdown that's linked to low levels of employee engagement. See, quality, it's not easy to maintain quality when people aren't applying that additional discretionary effort, when they just don't care as much. The culprit here probably has something to do with poorly communicated roles and responsibilities. The solution is to set standards that are clear, consistent, fair, and reasonable. Setting the expectations and giving 3W feedback that shows how they tie into the big picture is absolutely essential. So let me just give you some additional thoughts about setting clear expectations. Remember those 4 reasons that people leave a job? Without expectations, they don't have a sense of what it takes to be successful, their manager doesn't provide clear and consistent expectations, the manager isn't showing clear ways to enhance earning potential and career development, and the manager is not providing regular feedback or coaching. Those were those reasons. Well, notice that setting and communicating those expectations is a significant part of the reasons that people leave. So the expectations you set, they should start with the job description. They should evolve with employee input. They should talk about not just what to do, but why it matters to do it, and how much of it needs to be done, and what success looks like, what's going to be measured, and why, so it doesn't feel like it's just arbitrary. And with all those expectations, every time you set them, every time you talk about them, you'll want to be sure and help the employee see the link to the big picture, why it is that you're asking them to do the work they do, and what impact it will have. Clear expectations, as well as setting the roles and responsibilities so everyone understands the expectations you have of others, can help your team to be far more effective than it might be today, and can help to bridge any gaps that people have with all of the performance issues we've been talking about. Communications are the heart of success. We do have a training course that teaches everything you've heard here today and a lot more. That's the Workplace Conversations program. It is offered in both English and Spanish for English and Spanish-speaking supervisors. This program is taught by our bilingual trainers, and it's complete with workplace applications, with job aids. You'll have PowerPoint slides and workbooks that people can use. It's a very robust program. Here at People First Productivity Solutions, we offer that kind of training. There's a form you can fill out if you're interested in this particular program, but we also offer coaching, consultation, workplace surveys, and team assessments, all the tools you need to make your managers and supervisors more effective and to help your teams be more effective. For anyone who's listening to this webinar who needs a free resource, you're working individually, perhaps you're unable to bring in training or coaching for your team. There's a self-paced course for emerging leaders, and although it doesn't cover all the same content, it's actually a pretty good starting point. It's a great starting point if you're working on any of the things we've talked about: productivity declines, quality of work issues, little or no initiative being shown, negativity, conflict, finger pointing, absenteeism, customer satisfaction issues, people avoiding tough assignments, or people not speaking up at meetings, any and all of this. So often it's linked to communications breakdowns, and to get back on track, feel free to reach out to us. Let's talk more. There are many more tools I could point you toward, in addition to all the attachments that are already here with the webinar. I hope you're downloading every single one of those. As we wrap up, I've got one question here I have not yet answered, and I'd like to answer any others that you are posting at the moment. Let me give you this question. The participant in this webinar has written, what can be done when dealing with suppliers? And there is a breakdown in communication, lack of response, delayed responses, etc. How can the communications be turned around? I really like this question because I think people often treat suppliers differently than they treat others inside their own organization. And as a vendor, as a supplier to organizations, and someone who has worked with many vendors and suppliers when I was in a Fortune 500 role, my first piece of advice, my first reaction is, what would happen if you took everything we've just talked about and everything you already do inside your organization and used those very same techniques with a supplier? I'm talking about 3W feedback that explains the problem, the impact, and what you must see done differently. Setting those expectations, holding the supplier accountable to them, making sure that the supplier feels a sense of belonging, why the supplier matters, and how you want them to be a contributor to your team, helping them to see the bigger picture and to be inspired by it. No matter how mundane the transactional nature is with that supplier, there's room to get them more invested and to help them to see things differently. So I strongly encourage that you try some of those techniques first. That might be something that you can turn around. Now, if the supplier or their representative is simply not communicating and you can't break through with some of these techniques, I'll be the first, even as a supplier, I'll be the first to say maybe that's not the right partnership. You do deserve better. So try these techniques first, and then don't be afraid to find someone who will be more responsive. Well, with that, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for being here. Email me any additional questions, and don't forget to post a review. Your feedback is very, very important to me.